It was a time when the color of your skin dictated where you could walk, where you could eat, and where you could die. But in the unforgiving concrete jungle of New York City, two men dared to ignore the lines drawn in the sand. Uptown, in the beating heart of Harlem, the air smelled of soul food and simmering revolution. There sat a man who played chess with the focus of a grandmaster and recited Shakespeare before ordering a hit. He was the quiet storm, the professor, who refused to bow to any master. Downtown, in the shadowy labyrinth of Greenwich Village, silence was the only law. There lurked a former boxer, a mountain of muscle who would later become infamous for wandering the streets in a bathrobe, mumbling at parking meters to mask his ruthless genius. One was fighting for the dignity of his community. The other was fighting to control the machinery of the entire underworld. When Bumpy Johnson stood his ground against the encroaching tide of the Genovese family, represented by the lethal and unpredictable Vincent Gigante, the streets didn't just bleed. They changed forever. How did an educated black gangster and a mumbling Italian enforcer forge a legacy that outlived them both? And in a game where everyone cheats, who actually won? The story of a king does not begin on the throne. It begins in the dirt. For Bumpy Johnson, that dirt was the dust of Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the sun was hot, but the hatred was hotter. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson on Halloween in 1905, he was a child marked from the start. They called him Bumpy because of a slight deformation on the back of his head, a nickname that sounded harmless, almost playful. But there was nothing playful about the world he was born into. In the early 20th century South, a young black boy with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue was not seen as a prodigy. He was seen as a target. Bumpy Johnson was not the type to lower his eyes when a white man walked by. His intelligence was a weapon, and his pride was his shield. When his family realized that his refusal to bow would likely end with him hanging from a tree, they made a desperate decision. They sent him north to Harlem for safety. They thought they were sending him away from the violence. In reality, they were sending a shark into the open ocean. Harlem in the 1920s was a symphony of contradictions. It was the Harlem Renaissance, where jazz poured out of brownstones like liquid gold, but it was also a battleground. Young Bumpy didn't just survive the transition, he studied it. While other street toughs were busy buying flashy suits, Bumpy Johnson was buying books. He was a paradox that the streets couldn't quite figure out. A thug who could quote history and philosophy, a gangster who carried a knife in one pocket and a library card in the other. His education truly began not in a school, but behind the bars of a prison cell. During a decade-long stint for armed burglary, Bumpy Johnson transformed himself. He realized that brute force was a limited currency, but intellect was infinite. He read voraciously, studying the strategies of generals and kings. When he emerged, he wasn't just an enforcer anymore. He was a strategist. He caught the eye of Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary queen of numbers in Harlem. She needed a warrior to protect her operation from the invading white mobsters like Dutch Schultz, and she found her general in Bumpy. He didn't just fight for her. He waged a tactical war, using guerrilla tactics that left the Italian and Jewish mobs baffled and bleeding. While Bumpy Johnson was quoting Shakespeare and defending Harlem, a very different kind of education was taking place in the gritty gyms of Lower Manhattan. Vincent Gigante, born in 1928 to Italian immigrants, was learning the physics of violence. They called him the Chin. Some say it was because of his prominent jawline. Others claim it was a mispronunciation of Cinzano, a nickname his mother used. Regardless of the origin, the name would soon strike fear into the hearts of hardened criminals. But before he was a gangster, Vincent Gigante was a fighter. Between 1944 and 1947, Gigante fought 25 professional boxing matches. He was a light heavyweight who knew how to take a hit and keep moving forward. The boxing ring is a place of brutal honesty. There is nowhere to hide. It was here that Gigante learned the discipline that would define his criminal career. He learned that the loudest guy in the room is usually the weakest, and the one who strikes without warning is the one who wins. He won 21 of those fights, but the boxing world was too small for his ambition. The streets of Greenwich Village offered a different kind of prize money. Vincent Gigante drifted from the canvas of the ring to the pavement of the Genovese Crime Family. He didn't bring books or philosophy to the table like Bumpy Johnson. He brought silence. He brought an unnerving ability to follow orders with cold, mechanical precision. While Bumpy was building a reputation as a man of the people, a Robin Hood figure who paid for rents and turkey dinner for the poor in Harlem, Gigante was building a reputation as a ghost. He was rising through the ranks of the Mafia, not by being flashy, but by being reliable. He became a protege of Vito Genovese, the boss himself. This was a critical distinction in their origins. Bumpy Johnson rose by leading. Vincent Gigante rose by serving, waiting for his turn to take the crown. By the mid-1950s, the lines were being drawn. Harlem was becoming a gold mine for the heroin trade, a business that the Italian families were desperate to control. Bumpy Johnson, now the undisputed Godfather of Harlem, stood as the gatekeeper. He had spent years fortifying his castle, earning the loyalty of the streets through blood and benevolence. He had outlived Dutch Schultz. He had outsmarted the police. But now, he was facing a new breed of enemy. The Genovese family wasn't just a gang. It was a corporation of crime, and Vincent Gigante was one of its most promising executives. The collision course was set. On one side, you had the dignity of the struggle, a man who saw himself as a protector of his race, a man who had to be twice as smart and twice as ruthless just to survive. On the other side, you had the weight of tradition, a former boxer who viewed violence as a job, a man who believed in the absolute power of the organization. The contrast was stark. Bumpy Johnson walked the streets of Harlem like a politician, shaking hands and kissing babies, always impeccably dressed, his eyes scanning for threats. Vincent Gigante moved in the shadows, his face a mask of stone, his mind already plotting moves 5 steps ahead. The boxer and the professor were about to meet, and the city of New York was the prize. It wasn't just a clash of territories. It was a clash of cultures. The jazz-infused, soulful resilience of Harlem crashing against the silent, ironclad code of the Italian Mafia. Bumpy Johnson knew that to let the Italians in without a fight would be to sell the soul of his community. Vincent Gigante knew that to fail in expanding the family's business was a death sentence. From the dusty roads of Charleston to the blood-stained ropes of a boxing ring, their paths were winding toward a single point of impact. The stage was set for a war that would redefine the underworld. By the late 1950s, Harlem was not just a neighborhood. It was a kingdom, and Bumpy Johnson sat on the throne. He didn't wear a crown of gold. He wore fedoras and tailored suits that cost more than most men made in a year. To walk down 125th Street with Bumpy was to walk with royalty. He was the Godfather of Harlem, a title that wasn't given lightly. It was earned through a complex mix of benevolence and brutality. At the peak of his power, Bumpy Johnson controlled the numbers racket, the illegal lottery that was the lifeblood of the local economy. But he understood that the winds of change were blowing, carrying the scent of something far more profitable and far more destructive: heroin. The French Connection was pumping narcotics into New York City, and the 5 families of the Mafia were hungry to turn Harlem into their personal distribution hub. This is where the irresistible force met the immovable object. The Genovese Crime Family, one of the most powerful organizations in the history of the American Mafia, saw Harlem as a gold mine. They had the supply, but they didn't have the access. They needed the streets, but the streets belonged to Bumpy. Enter Vincent Gigante, the man they called the Chin. At this stage in his career, Gigante was a rising star, a capo regime who was feared for his size and his silence. He was the hammer the Genovese family used when a nail refused to go down. The meetings between the Italian mob and the Black Syndicate were legendary for their tension. Usually, the Mafia dictated terms. They were used to walking into a room and owning it. But when Vincent Gigante and the Genovese representatives sat across from Bumpy Johnson, the dynamic shifted. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't stutter. He looked them in the eye and spoke with the diction of a professor. He made it clear, if you want to sell in Harlem, you pay a tax to Harlem. And the tax collector was Bumpy. It was a dangerous game of chicken. The Mafia could have easily ordered a hit, and they tried. But Bumpy Johnson was elusive, and more importantly, he was beloved. Killing him would have started a riot that would have burned the city to the ground, closing the drug market for everyone. Vincent Gigante, with his street-honed instincts, recognized this. He saw in Bumpy something rare, a man of principle in a world of opportunists. A strange, grudging respect formed between the two factions. It wasn't friendship. Gangsters don't have friends, they have interests, but it was a professional understanding. Bumpy Johnson negotiated a deal that was unheard of at the time. He allowed the Genovese Crime Family to bring their product into his territory, but only on his terms. He controlled the runners, the dealers, and the corners. In exchange, he took a significant cut. This period marked the zenith of Bumpy's influence. He became a celebrity in his own right, rubbing shoulders with icons like Billie Holiday and Sugar Ray Robinson. He was a patron of the arts and a protector of the poor. If a widow couldn't pay her rent, Bumpy paid it. If a kid needed tuition, Bumpy provided it. This wasn't just charity, it was strategy. By winning the hearts of the people, he created an army of eyes and ears on the street. No police officer or rival gangster could move in Harlem without Bumpy knowing about it 5 minutes later. Meanwhile, Vincent Gigante was solidifying his own legend downtown. He wasn't playing the celebrity, he was playing the ghost. While Bumpy was holding court at the Wells restaurant, Gigante was mastering the art of insulation. He was learning how to run a crime family from the shadows, a skill that would serve him well in the decades to come. But even as he rose to become the acting boss, he never forgot the man uptown. The relationship between Vincent Gigante and Bumpy Johnson proved that in the underworld, color lines could be crossed if the money was right and the respect was mutual. However, the Godfather of Harlem was walking a razor's edge. The heroin that made him rich was slowly poisoning the very community he swore to protect. The duality of his existence was becoming a heavy burden. He was the hero who paid for turkeys on Thanksgiving, but he was also the villain who allowed the needle to find the vein. As the 1960s roared on, the pressure mounted. The FBI was closing in. The civil rights movement was exploding, and figures like Malcolm X, an old friend of Bumpy's from his Detroit Red days, were challenging the morality of the criminal lifestyle. Bumpy Johnson found himself caught between the past and the future. He had conquered the underworld. He had forced the Genovese crime family to treat him as an equal, and he had outlived nearly all of his contemporaries. But the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. Bumpy stood at the summit of the criminal world, looking down at a Harlem that was changing faster than he could control. The Chin was watching from the village, biding his time. The peak had been reached, but the descent was inevitable. The golden age of the gentleman gangster was about to end, and the fall would be hard. And O King rules forever. By the mid-1960s, the world that Bumpy Johnson had mastered was crumbling beneath his feet. The Harlem of jazz clubs and sharp suits was being replaced by a Harlem of riots, burnt-out buildings, and anger. The rules of the game were changing, and for an old-school gangster who prided himself on honor and etiquette, the new world was a foreign, hostile place. The first blow to the armor of the Godfather of Harlem was his time in Alcatraz. Prison was nothing new to Bumpy, but Alcatraz was different. It was a tomb for the living, a rock in the middle of the freezing bay designed to break the spirit of the hardest men. While he sat in his cell, watching the fog roll over San Francisco, the streets of New York moved on without him. When he was finally released, he returned to a kingdom that no longer bowed the same way. The respect was still there, but it was mixed with a sense that he was a relic, a lion returning to a savannah now overrun by hyenas. The drug trade, which Bumpy Johnson had reluctantly facilitated, had turned into a monster. It was no longer a business, it was a plague. The young dealers on the corner didn't care about community or rules. They didn't quote philosophy, they only spoke the language of greed. Bumpy found himself fighting a war on two fronts, against the law enforcement that wanted to make an example of him, and against the erosion of the code he lived by. He was a man out of time, trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. Meanwhile, downtown, Vincent Gigante was facing his own crisis, but his response was not one of stoic defiance. It was a performance of Shakespearean madness. The law was closing in on the Genovese crime family, and the Chin knew that prison was a trap he had to avoid at all costs. While Bumpy stood tall, Gigante began to hunch. He started the act. It began slowly, a blank stare here, a mumbled sentence there. But soon, the fearsome enforcer was seen wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, unshaven and disheveled. He would urinate in public. He would hold conversations with parking meters. To the outside world, Vincent Gigante had lost his mind. To the insiders, it was a stroke of genius. He was weaponizing insanity to plead incompetence, keeping the FBI at bay while he continued to pull the strings of the family from the shadows. The contrast between the two men in their twilight years was haunting. Bumpy Johnson refused to hide. He walked 125th Street with his head held high, facing the decay of his neighborhood and his own failing health with a grim determination. Vincent Gigante chose to hide in plain sight, discarding his dignity to preserve his power. One died a little every day by watching his world fall apart. The other survived by pretending his mind had fallen apart. The physical toll on Bumpy was becoming impossible to ignore. His heart, which had withstood decades of stress, betrayal, and violence, was beginning to fail. He knew the end was coming. He spoke of it not with fear, but with a quiet acceptance. He had outlived the hitmen, the judges, and the rivals. But he couldn't outrun time. The end did not come with a bang. There was no shootout in a rainy alley, no dramatic betrayal by a close friend. On the morning of July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson went to his favorite spot, Wells Restaurant in Harlem. It was a place where he had held court for years, a place that felt like home. He ordered a simple meal, chicken legs and coffee. The Godfather of Harlem was surrounded by his people, the waitress pouring his coffee just the way he liked it. Suddenly, he clutched his chest. The pain was sharp and final. He collapsed, not as a gangster, but as a man. In those chaotic final moments, as the restaurant staff scrambled and patrons gasped, the legend of Bumpy Johnson took its last breath. He died in the arms of his childhood friend, Junie Bird. The silence that followed was louder than any siren. News of his death spread through Harlem like a shockwave. People didn't just mourn a crime boss, they mourned the end of an era. With Bumpy gone, the dam broke. The order he had maintained, however fragile, shattered. The streets descended into chaos as younger, more reckless figures scrambled for the crown. The protection he offered against the worst impulses of the mafia and the police evaporated. Vincent Gigante outlived his rival by decades, continuing his bizarre charade of madness well into the 1990s. But in a way, Bumpy's exit was the more dignified one. He died as he lived, in the heart of Harlem, surrounded by the rhythm of the street. The Chin lived on, but he lived in a prison of his own making, trapped behind a mask of insanity that he could never take off. The death of Bumpy Johnson was not just the death of a man. It was the death of the gentleman gangster. After him, there were no more rules. The chessboard was kicked over, and the pieces were scattered in the gutter. The Genovese crime family would continue to make millions, and Vincent Gigante would eventually rise to be the boss of bosses, but he would never command the kind of love that Bumpy did. Bumpy didn't just own the streets. He was the streets. And when his heart stopped, Harlem missed a beat that it would never find again. History is often written by the victors, but folklore is written by the people. In the grand tapestry of American crime, few figures have captured the global imagination like Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Gigante. They have transcended their rap sheets to become archetypes of a bygone era, viewed through the lens of Hollywood, music, and the gritty nostalgia of the streets. To the American public and the world watching from afar, Bumpy Johnson represents something far more complex than a mere drug lord. He sits at the intersection of organized crime and the civil rights movement, a unique position that has fascinated screenwriters and historians alike. In the American psyche, there is a deep-seated obsession with the noble outlaw, the individual who lives outside the law because the law itself is unjust. Bumpy fits this mold perfectly. He is viewed not just as a gangster, but as a mechanism of resistance. Hollywood has spent decades trying to capture his essence. In the 1997 film Hoodlum, Lawrence Fishburne portrayed him as a suave, intellectual warrior fighting against white mobsters like Dutch Schultz. It painted him as a defender of Harlem sovereignty. Later, in American Gangster, Ridley Scott showed us the funeral of Bumpy Johnson as the end of an era, paving the way for Frank Lucas. But it is the recent series Godfather of Harlem, starring Forrest Whitaker, that has truly cemented Bumpy's legacy for a new generation. It explores the what-ifs, his friendship with Malcolm X, his battles with the Genovese crime family, and his role as a shadow politician. The world sees Bumpy as the Black Godfather, a title that carries immense weight. He shattered the stereotype of the uneducated street thug. He showed the world that a black man in 1960s America could outthink, outmaneuver, and outnegotiate the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet. For African American culture, he remains a complicated figure, a man who poisoned the community with drugs but also funded its survival with the profits. He is the ultimate anti-hero, a reminder that in a segregated America, power had to be taken, not asked for. On the other side of the coin, we have Vincent Gigante. If Bumpy is the tragic hero, the Chin is the enigma. The American fascination with the Mafia runs deep, fueled by The Godfather and Goodfellas, but Gigante offers a narrative that no movie could invent. He is known globally as the Odd Father. The image of a powerful mafia boss wandering Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, mumbling to himself, has become one of the most surreal snapshots of 20th century crime. For years, the FBI, the media, and the public were baffled. Was he truly insane, or was he the smartest man in the room? When it was finally revealed that his insanity was a carefully crafted ruse, a performance that lasted for decades to avoid prosecution, the world was stunned. It turned Vincent Gigante into a symbol of the Mafia's absolute commitment to omerta, the code of silence, and self-preservation. He didn't care about looking cool. He cared about staying free. From a global perspective, the clash between Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Gigante is seen as the final stand of the old New York. International audiences look at this story and see the raw, unfiltered history of American capitalism in its darkest form. It's a story about territories, monopolies, and the violent merger of corporations. Bumpy represented the local, independent business fighting against the corporate takeover of the Italian syndicate. The legacy of these two men also highlights a stark racial divide in how we remember criminals. For decades, the Italian Mafia was romanticized. They were the wise guys, the men of honor. Black organized crime was often dismissed or portrayed as chaotic. But the story of Bumpy and the Chin forces a correction of that record. It shows that the organization, discipline, and honor among thieves were not exclusive to the Italians. Bumpy Johnson forced the Genovese crime family to respect him not out of charity, but because he was their equal in every way that mattered. Today, you can walk through Harlem and still find old-timers who speak of Bumpy with a reverence usually reserved for saints. They don't talk about the heroin. They talk about the turkey dinners, the rent payments, the time he stood up to a cop who was harassing a kid. Down in the village, the stories of Gigante are whispered like ghost stories. Tales of a man who was so feared that people wouldn't even say his name, simply touching their chin to refer to him. In the end, the American perspective on these two men is a reflection of America itself. A place of brutal contradictions, where a man can be a killer and a savior, a madman and a genius. They are the dark mirrors of the American dream, proving that with enough ambition and enough bullets, you can carve your name into history, even if you have to burn half the city to do it. The chess game is over. The pieces have been put back in the box, and the lights have dimmed on the stage of 125th Street. But in the quiet corners of Harlem, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the king. Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Gigante were men cut from the same rough cloth, yet they wore it differently. One wore it like a tuxedo, demanding to be seen, to be respected, to be treated as a man in a world that wanted to treat him as less. The other wore it like a shroud, hiding his brilliance behind a mask of madness, sacrificing his dignity to preserve his freedom. Some stories end without closure, but dignity doesn't need applause. Bumpy Johnson died as he lived, not in a prison cell, but in the neighborhood he loved, surrounded by the people he protected. He left behind a legacy that challenges us to ask, what is the price of loyalty? When the Genovese crime family came knocking, he didn't build a wall, he built a table. He showed us that true power isn't just about violence. It's about the intelligence to know when to fight and the wisdom to know when to talk. Vincent the Chin Gigante taught the world a darker lesson, that sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one everyone thinks is crazy. He played the long game, a game of patience and silence that outlasted nearly everyone else. History will call them criminals. The FBI files will call them monsters. But to the streets that raised them, there was something else entirely. They were the architects of an underworld that had its own code, its own honor, and its own tragic beauty. They remind us that even in the darkest shadows, there are men who refuse to be broken by the weight of the world. So, tonight, as we look back at the smoke and the ruins of that era, we don't just see gangsters. We see the struggle for survival. We see the gentleman and the madman, forever locked in a dance of power. What about you? If you stood at the crossroads of history in 1960s New York, which path would you choose? The path of the public king like Bumpy Johnson, or the path of the silent ghost like Vincent Gigante? If this story moved you, if it made you see the history of the streets in a new light, hit that like button. It tells us you want more true stories from shadows. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the underworld has 1,000 more tales to tell, and we are just getting started. Tell us in the comments, does the end justify the means?